October 15, 1935. The Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey. Dutch Schultz, one of the most feared gangsters in America, walked into what he thought was just another Tuesday night meeting with his crew. He had no idea that exactly 8 days earlier, he'd made a decision that signed his own death warrant. The man who ordered his execution? Lucky Luciano, the calculating genius who would transform organized crime forever. Dutch's fatal mistake wasn't stealing money. It wasn't betraying the mob. It was something far more dangerous. He threatened to kill a man that the entire underworld had agreed was untouchable. And when Dutch refused to back down, Lucky Luciano made a decision that would echo through criminal history. Dutch Schultz had to die. What happened in those 8 days between Dutch's threat and the bullets that ended his reign is one of the most dramatic stories in American crime history. It's a tale of ego versus strategy, old-school brutality versus New World business sense, and one man's refusal to evolve in a world that was changing faster than he could understand. Before we reveal how Lucky Luciano orchestrated one of the most significant mob hits in history, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you never miss stories of power, betrayal, and justice. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Now let's dive into the 8 days that changed organized crime forever. To understand why Dutch Schultz's decision was so catastrophically stupid, you need to understand the world of organized crime in 1935 and the two very different men at the center of this story. Dutch Schultz, born Arthur Flegenheimer in the Bronx, was a product of the old-school gangster mentality. He came up through the streets during Prohibition, building an empire on bootlegging, illegal gambling, and the numbers racket in Harlem. By the early 1930s, Dutch controlled one of the most profitable criminal operations in New York, pulling in an estimated $20 million a year, the equivalent of over $400 million today. But Dutch was known for something beyond his wealth, his brutality and his unpredictable temper. He once beat a man nearly to death with a tire iron over a small debt. He taxed other criminals who operated in his territory and killed anyone who refused to pay. His nickname came from his early gang, the Schultz Truckers, named after a notorious street gang. Dutch was feared, ruthless, and completely unwilling to compromise. Lucky Luciano was the complete opposite, at least in style. Born Salvatore Lucania in Sicily, Lucky came to America as a child and grew up in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. By 1935, he'd already revolutionized organized crime by helping to create the Commission, a governing body that brought together the major crime families to settle disputes without constant bloodshed. Lucky understood something that Dutch never grasped. In the modern world, smart business made more money than mindless violence. Lucky had vision. He saw organized crime as a business that needed structure, rules, and cooperation. He'd already helped eliminate the old mustache Petes, the old-world Italian bosses who refused to work with non-Italians and who ruled through fear rather than strategy. By 1935, Lucky Luciano was the most powerful mobster in America, and Dutch Schultz was a problem that was about to explode. The trouble started with a man named Thomas Dewey. In 1935, Dewey was a 33-year-old special prosecutor who'd been appointed to take down organized crime in New York City. He was ambitious, brilliant, and absolutely relentless. Dewey had his sights set on becoming the next governor of New York, maybe even president someday, and he knew that bringing down major gangsters would make him a national hero. Dutch Schultz became Dewey's primary target. Dewey had accountants digging through Dutch's finances, witnesses testifying about his operations, and a grand jury ready to indict him on multiple charges. Dutch had already beaten one tax evasion case by temporarily fleeing to New Jersey, but this time Dewey was building an ironclad case. Dutch was looking at serious prison time, maybe even life behind bars. Most mobsters would have used their lawyers, bribed some officials, or laid low for a while. But Dutch Schultz wasn't most mobsters. Dutch's solution was simple and insane. Kill Thomas Dewey. In early October 1935, Dutch called for a meeting of the Commission. This was the governing body of major crime bosses that Lucky Luciano had helped establish, men like Meyer Lansky, Joe Adonis, Frank Costello, and representatives from other families. Dutch arrived at the meeting with a proposal that shocked even these hardened criminals. "I want permission to hit Dewey," Dutch announced, his voice carrying the same casual tone he might use to order a sandwich. "He's coming after me. He's coming after all of us eventually, and the only way to stop him is to put him in the ground." The room went silent. Every man there understood the implications. Thomas Dewey wasn't some rival gangster or a corrupt cop on someone's payroll. He was a legitimate government prosecutor, a public figure, a man with a wife and children. He represented the law, and there were rules, unwritten but universally understood, about what you could and couldn't do. Lucky Luciano spoke first, his voice calm but firm. "Dutch, you kill a prosecutor, especially someone as high profile as Dewey, and you bring down heat on all of us that will never escape. The feds will come after every operation we've got. It's bad business." Meyer Lansky, Lucky's closest advisor and one of the smartest minds in organized crime, added his voice. "It's suicide, Dutch. They'll hunt down everyone even remotely connected to it. You think the government's coming after you now? Kill Dewey, and they'll never stop." But Dutch Schultz wasn't interested in logic or long-term consequences. His empire was under attack, his freedom was at stake, and his old-school mentality told him that violence was always the answer. "I don't need your permission," Dutch said, his temper starting to show. "I'm telling you what I'm going to do. Dewey dies, the investigation falls apart, and we all go back to business as usual." The meeting ended with the commission voting down Dutch's proposal. It was unanimous. Killing Thomas Dewey was absolutely forbidden. Lucky made it clear. "Dutch, if you go after Dewey, you're on your own. The commission will not support this, and there will be consequences." Dutch stormed out of that meeting, rage burning in his eyes. He'd been told no, and Dutch Schultz didn't accept no from anyone. That meeting happened on October 7, 1935. Dutch Schultz had 8 days left to live. The days following that commission meeting were filled with tension that spread through New York's underworld like electricity through water. Everyone knew that Dutch Schultz was unpredictable, and everyone knew that Lucky Luciano didn't make empty threats. Dutch returned to his operations in Newark, seething with anger and resentment. In his mind, the commission had betrayed him. He'd built his empire through strength and violence, and now these businessmen mobsters were trying to tell him what he could and couldn't do. He'd handled his problems his way for years, and it had made him rich and powerful. Why should he change now? What Dutch didn't understand was that the world had already changed around him. The old days of prohibition were over. The new criminal landscape required sophistication, political connections, and the ability to operate under the radar. Dutch represented everything that the new generation of mobsters was trying to move away from: excessive violence, public attention, and reckless decision-making. In those 8 days, Dutch began making plans to kill Thomas Dewey anyway. He started gathering information about Dewey's routine, his home address, his schedule. Dutch had a trusted hitman, a cold-blooded killer who'd carried out dozens of murders for him over the years. The plan was simple: catch Dewey on his way to work, make it look like a robbery gone wrong, and eliminate the problem before the indictment could be finalized. But Dutch made a critical error. He talked about his plans. Not openly, but in the way that powerful men often do, assuming their authority protects them from consequences. He mentioned his intentions to a few trusted associates, made phone calls that weren't as secure as he thought, and generally acted as if the commission's decision didn't matter. Word got back to Lucky Luciano within 3 days. Lucky called an emergency meeting with his closest advisors, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, Joe Adonis, and Vito Genovese. These men represented the future of organized crime. Smart, strategic, and willing to make hard decisions for the greater good of their organization. "Dutch is going ahead with the Dewey hit," Lucky told them, his voice grave. "He's ignoring the commission, ignoring common sense, and he's going to bring down the entire outfit." Meyer Lansky, perhaps the most analytical mind in the room, laid out the scenarios. "If Dutch kills Dewey, every federal agent in the country comes after us. Our operations get shut down, our political protection disappears, and we all end up dead or in prison. But if we let him do it and don't respond, the commission becomes meaningless. Every hothead will think they can ignore our decisions." Frank Costello, known as the Prime Minister of the underworld for his political connections, added another concern. "I've got relationships with police commissioners, judges, politicians. The moment Dewey gets killed, those relationships are worthless. Nobody will want to be associated with us." The discussion went on for hours, but the conclusion was inevitable. Dutch Schultz had become a liability too dangerous to allow to continue. He defied the commission, threatened the entire structure they'd built, and shown no signs of backing down. Lucky Luciano made the decision that would define his legacy. Dutch Schultz had to be eliminated. "This isn't personal," Lucky said to the men in the room. "This is business. Dutch is risking everything we've built, and he's doing it because he can't see past his own ego. We gave him a chance to back down. He didn't take it. The contract went out immediately." Lucky wanted it done fast, clean, and in a way that sent a clear message to anyone else who might consider defying the commission. The men chosen for the job were professionals: Charlie the Bug Workman and Emmanuel Mendy Weiss, two of Murder Incorporated's most reliable killers. Murder Incorporated was the enforcement arm of the commission, a group of contract killers who operated with cold efficiency. They didn't kill out of passion or rage, they killed because it was their job and they were very good at it. The order was simple: kill Dutch Schultz and his top lieutenants. Make it public enough to send a message, but clean enough to avoid excessive heat from the authorities. And do it before Dutch could carry out his plan against Dewey. Dutch Schultz, oblivious to the death sentence hanging over his head, continued his normal routine. He held court at his regular spots in Newark, conducted his business operations, and moved forward with his plans for Dewey. He believed his reputation and his past success made him untouchable. He'd survived gangland wars, beaten federal charges, and built an empire through sheer force of will. But Dutch was operating under an old-world assumption that personal power trumped organizational authority. In the new world that Lucky Luciano was building, that assumption was not just wrong, it was fatal. On October 15, 1935, exactly 8 days after the commission meeting where Dutch had been told no, Dutch walked into the Palace Chop House and Tavern in Newark for a meeting with 3 of his top men: Otto Abadaba Berman, his financial genius who ran the numbers racket, Abe Landau, his bodyguard and enforcer, and Bernard Lulu Rosenkrantz, another trusted lieutenant. The Palace Chop House was supposed to be safe territory. Dutch had been using it as a meeting place for months. The owner was on his payroll, and the location was in Newark, away from Manhattan's more dangerous territory. Dutch felt comfortable there, protected by his reputation and his armed bodyguards. He had no idea that Charlie Workman and Mendy Weiss were already in Newark, had been watching the restaurant for hours, and were about to walk through the front door with murder on their minds. At approximately 10:15 p.m. on October 23, 1935, Charlie Workman and Mendy Weiss entered the Palace Chop House. They wore long coats that concealed their weapons, .38 caliber revolvers that had been carefully prepared for this exact moment. Dutch Schultz was in the restroom at the back of the restaurant when they arrived. His 3 lieutenants sat at a round table in the main dining area, discussing business over steaks and whiskey. The timing was perfect, or perhaps carefully planned by someone who knew Dutch's habits. Workman and Weiss didn't hesitate. They walked straight to the table and opened fire. The sound of gunshots shattered the quiet evening. Otto Berman was hit multiple times and collapsed immediately. Abe Landau, despite being shot in the chest, managed to return fire, hitting Weiss in the shoulder. Lulu Rosenkrantz also drew his weapon, but he was already fatally wounded. The gunfight lasted less than 30 seconds, but it filled the restaurant with smoke, screaming, and the smell of gunpowder. Charlie Workman, seeing that Dutch wasn't at the table, made a decision that would cement the hit as one of the most thorough in mob history. He moved toward the back of the restaurant, following the layout he'd memorized during surveillance. He found Dutch Schultz in the restroom, still unaware of what was happening in the dining room. Dutch looked up, his eyes widening as he recognized the threat. But before he could react, Workman fired once, hitting Dutch in the lower abdomen. Dutch collapsed against the restroom wall, mortally wounded. Workman didn't fire again. The single shot was enough, and he needed to leave before police arrived. He ran back through the restaurant, past the bodies of Dutch's lieutenants, and out into the Newark night. Within minutes, police and ambulances arrived. They found a scene of carnage, 4 men shot, blood pooling on the floor, and witnesses too terrified to provide coherent statements. Dutch Schultz was still alive, clutching his stomach, his face pale with shock and blood loss. He was rushed to Newark City Hospital, where doctors worked frantically to save his life. But the bullet had torn through his intestines, causing massive internal damage and infection. In 1935, before modern antibiotics and advanced surgical techniques, such a wound was almost always fatal. Dutch lingered for almost 24 hours, drifting in and out of consciousness. During his more lucid moments, he was questioned by police about who shot him. True to the code of the underworld, Dutch refused to name his killers. "I won't talk," he muttered through the pain. "I won't be a rat." But as his condition deteriorated and fever from infection ravaged his body, Dutch began to ramble. A police stenographer recorded his delirious words, a strange stream of consciousness monologue that has fascinated true crime enthusiasts for decades. Dutch talked about his mother, about money hidden in various locations, about enemies and friends, all in a jumbled narrative that made little sense. "A boy has never wept nor dashed 1,000 Kim," Dutch mumbled at one point, his mind failing as his body shut down. "Mother is the best bet, and don't let Satan draw you too fast." At 8:35 p.m. on October 24, 1935, Dutch Schultz died without ever regaining full consciousness. He was 33 years old, and his criminal empire died with him. The three men shot alongside Dutch also died from their wounds. Otto Berman died at the scene. Abe Landau and Lulu Rosenkrantz survived long enough to reach the hospital but died within hours. Lucky Luciano had ordered a complete elimination, and that's exactly what happened. Charlie Workman was eventually identified as the triggerman and spent 23 years in prison for the murders. But he never revealed who ordered the hit. Mindy Weiss was later executed for other crimes. And the truth about Lucky Luciano's role remained an open secret in the underworld. Everyone knew, but no one could prove it in court. Thomas Dewey, the prosecutor whose life Dutch had threatened, went on to have an extraordinary career. He became governor of New York and ran for president of the United States twice. He never knew how close he came to being murdered, though rumors of Dutch's plot eventually reached him years later. The assassination of Dutch Schultz marked a turning point in American organized crime. It proved that Lucky Luciano's vision of crime as a business that required structure, discipline, and adherence to collective decisions had triumphed over the old-school mentality of individual power and unchecked violence. Dutch Schultz's fatal mistake wasn't just defying the Commission's decision about Thomas Dewey. His real error was failing to understand that the world had changed. The days when a single powerful gangster could operate independently, making decisions based solely on personal interest, were over. Lucky Luciano and the Commission represented a new model. Organized crime that functioned like a corporation, with rules, structure, and consequences for those who threatened the entire organization. The lesson from those 8 days between the Commission meeting and Dutch's death resonates far beyond the criminal underworld. It's a story about the danger of ego, the importance of adapting to changing circumstances, and the consequences of defying collective wisdom for personal gain. Dutch believed his past success and personal power made him invulnerable. He'd built a massive criminal empire, survived gang wars, and beaten federal charges. In his mind, he was untouchable. But that confidence blinded him to the reality that the organization he was part of had evolved beyond any single individual's control. Lucky Luciano understood something fundamental. No person is bigger than the system. When Dutch threatened to kill Thomas Dewey, he wasn't just risking his own operation, he was risking everyone's. And in a business model based on mutual cooperation and shared risk, that kind of individual recklessness couldn't be tolerated. The decision to eliminate Dutch wasn't made in anger or revenge. It was a cold, calculated business decision. Lucky didn't hate Dutch. They'd even worked together in the past. But Lucky recognized that Dutch had become a threat to everything the Commission was trying to build. Personal feelings had to take a backseat to organizational survival. This principle applies far beyond organized crime. In any organization, corporate, political, or social, there comes a point where individual ambition must yield to collective goals. Leaders who refuse to recognize this reality, who believe their personal power exempts them from accountability, eventually face consequences. Dutch Schultz learned this lesson in the most final way possible. The speed of Dutch's elimination, just 8 days from defiance to death, also sends a powerful message about the importance of taking threats seriously. Dutch dismissed the Commission's authority, assuming his reputation would protect him. That assumption was his death sentence. When an organization makes clear that certain behaviors are unacceptable, testing those boundaries is incredibly dangerous. Lucky Luciano's handling of the Dutch Schultz situation also demonstrated sophisticated leadership. He gave Dutch a chance to back down, clearly communicated the consequences, and only acted when it became clear that Dutch was going to proceed anyway. The elimination wasn't impulsive or emotional. It was a last resort after other options were exhausted. The legacy of Dutch Schultz's death extended for decades. It established the Commission as the supreme authority in organized crime, and set a precedent that even the most powerful individuals had to respect collective decisions. It also demonstrated that Lucky Luciano was willing to make hard decisions to protect the organization's long-term interests, even if it meant eliminating someone he'd worked with before. Thomas Dewey's survival, made possible by Dutch's death, had enormous implications for American history. Dewey went on to become one of the most important political figures of his era, twice running for president and serving as New York's governor for 3 terms. His prosecutorial work against organized crime continued, though he never knew how close he came to being murdered. Ironically, Dutch Schultz's attempt to save himself by killing Dewey would have almost certainly destroyed him even if he'd succeeded. The heat from murdering a prosecutor would have been unbearable, and Dutch would have been hunted by every law enforcement agency in the country. His 8-day lifespan after defying the Commission might have been just days longer if he'd actually killed Dewey. The story of Dutch Schultz and Lucky Luciano reminds us that intelligence, strategy, and adaptability ultimately triumph over brute force and ego. Dutch was powerful, but he lacked vision. Lucky was visionary, and he understood that lasting power comes from building systems that transcend any individual. In those 8 days that changed everything, Lucky Luciano proved that the future belonged to those who could think strategically, work collectively, and make difficult decisions for the greater good. Dutch Schultz, trapped in an outdated mindset of personal power and violent solutions, paid the ultimate price for his inability to evolve. If this story of power, strategy, and the consequences of defying authority fascinated you, smash that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible true crime stories that reveal the hidden dynamics of power and survival. What do you think? Was Lucky Luciano justified in ordering Dutch's death, or was there another way? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And remember, whether in the underworld or the boardroom, those who refuse to adapt to changing times inevitably face consequences. The question is whether you'll learn that lesson the easy way or the hard way. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.